Well, I thought I'd give an update on the state of the presidential race and a few other items as it is of this afternoon on Saturday, September the 12th. Uh, uh, okay, here we are right now. The Real Clear Politics average of polls, which they have a lot of polls in it now, post convention, is 7.5% advantaged for Joe Biden. Um, I always try to look specifically at some of the polls. They range from a 2% um, for advantage for Biden to 12% advantage. And so you have a pretty wide range of options to believe in. And since these things usually have, plus or minus 3% bound, some of them as high as 4, some of them as low as 2, you can see that they all can't be right. That is to say, the methodologies um, probably are skewed in one direction or the other, depending on who you want to believe. Because, I mean, you could expect variations of a few percent, but not variations of 10%. That's that. And now in the set of highly competitive states, at least the ones that are usually judged that way, I think Biden's ahead by about 3.6% at the present time. Now, let's get into some situations here a little bit. Now, the Rasmussen poll, which I tend to follow a lot, largely because it has a unique methodology, and that consists of it uses automated voice rather than actually talking to a human being. And I think it's easier to punch 1, 2, or 3 on a phone without any emotional feeling than to tell somebody who you think has a certain attitude toward you, perhaps what you really think, or just to tell an individual what you really think. Now, some people like to get in your face, and other people are much shyer. But I tend to think this more anonymous approach tends to bring out more reality. And the other thing is they do consistent sets of polling, like their approval and disapproval poll is a 3-day moving average with a total of 1,500 samples in each one, exactly 1,500. I mean, because I'm always worried about something where you see a poll with 782 respondents, and I'm going, why did you pick 782? I mean, did you get the answer you wanted when you hit 782 in your sample and just said, well, I'm going to call it quits because I like the answer? And if it wasn't what you wanted, would you go on to maybe 1,200 or 1,500 to make sure you got what you wanted? I mean, you see the thing I'm getting at here. Consistency of methodology is kind of important too. And some polls, like say Quinnipiac, is kind of a notoriously liberal-oriented polls, so you always have that. And there's some polls they're actually partisan polls. I'm like PPP and was it Change Research? I think it is. They actually put D behind on the Real Clear Politics average, and that probably means that it's a polling organization that usually does contract work for Democrat campaigns. And so, I mean, whether that doesn't mean they're invalid or at all, but just something like a disclosure, so you know that. So right now it looks like Trump's still has a big challenge ahead of him, and I think people shouldn't get too dispirited yet. I mean, after all, the latest Rasmussen poll has it as 48 Biden, I think, and 46 Trump, with something like 4% for other candidate and something like 2 or 3%. Well, it doesn't add up exactly, so they should do the round off to a single tenth so we know what it is. Probably it's really 3 point something for the other candidates and something on the order of 2 point something for, uh, uh, undecided or whatever. But the point I'm getting at is, or maybe there's a little bit of variation in the 2 lead candidates. Doesn't matter about these things. The basic point is that still presents a pure challenge. And one thing I think it will be important as things go forward is, do the people who are voting for the other 2 candidates, who I'm not sure I exactly remember their names exactly, which isn't good for that happening, but there's a Libertarian and a Green Party candidate. And in the last election, I always remind everybody that 5.9% of the votes went for these other candidates. And that was, I think, kind of significant in that a lot of what I would call anti-Trump votes, I believe they were largely, although some of them were anti-Hillary votes as well, went to the other candidates, which helped Trump out in a lot of these marginal races, like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Well, if these third-party candidates completely collapse this time, that probably is bad for Trump. what may be good for Trump is that Joe Biden on the campaign trail is becoming a little bit more and more uh, showing his deficiencies, I think. I mean, he seems to be fed scripted questions, and in one instance, it appears he's even reading the answers off a teleprompter and having trouble doing that. So that doesn't necessarily bode well for his performance in a 90-minute live debate. Um, where those presumably that won't happen. Certainly, the first debate is with Chris Wallace. While I think Chris Wallace is a Democrat, I believe that Fox News is not going to allow him to engage in scripted questions with Biden or Trump either. And so that'll be an interesting situation. And I tend to think that the biggest hope, one of the biggest hopes for Trump would be if Biden were to actually become somewhat incoherent in his answers and show that he really does have some diminished capacity. If that occurs, I think that will definitely help Trump out a lot. The other possibility is, of course, that Trump will just underperform in the debate for some strange reason. Rumor has it he's not really doing a lot of prep sessions, but again, rumor's often wrong. I don't know, or whether he needs to. He seems to be so used to answering questions off the cuff that he probably will do pretty good. And if you get a candidate too pre-programmed to answer things, they'll forget what they're trying to say and end up delivering it poorly anyhow. And so that's something to consider. Also, this was a week with week and a few days of two major Democrat attacks. The Atlantic article suggesting that Trump didn't respect our troops or our veterans, which was kind of an absurd claim. I mean, doesn't make any sense at all, really. And the other one, of course, was the Woodward book, and the whole thing about what he said he knew on February the 7th and how that was supposed to, in some way, differ from what he was saying publicly. And of course, Trump has taken his own stance on how to deal with that. In the first case, I think we've got almost everybody that was at the meeting says that's never happened, and it makes no sense at all they would make any kind of negative comment about Marines that died in World War I. The issue about Vietnam and what he thinks about Vietnam, well, that was a very controversial war for anybody who was service age during that time period anyhow, which ranged from everybody that signed up to go, that went to Canada to avoid going, to a lot of intermediate steps. And, pro and cons on that are quite normal. And I think that the key thing is in all these issues is he does respect the veterans, and he's done a lot to improve the VA benefits and the hospital services. So I think that this idea is just absurd. The other thing that they threw out, of course, was this whole deal about the virus, which is an ongoing issue. And it's kind of a no-win issue in a way. The real truth of the matter is I don't think that, and I think that's one of the problems that Trump probably shouldn't have given Woodward an interview at all anyhow. Because, I mean, it may very well be that on that day, on the 7th of February, he actually believed one thing, which is what he said. But he might very well have been told in a meeting 2 days later that, well, no, it may not be that bad after all. I mean, the experts were all over the place during February. And I don't even believe the lockdown in Italy had occurred until later. I mean, so, the idea that somebody had a clear idea of what to do with a novel disease that was just being studied, its infection rate was quite variable, and its fatality rate was a little bit up in the air too at that point. We got some real data in March and April, but that's a whole different issue and it's far later. And the other thing, when they said he wants to play things down, it's also true that, remember that we were already into the first 15-day lockdown at that point in time, so that's hardly playing things down. So I think this attack on Trump is another asinine move. And when you look at the Rasmussen tracking poll, which, whether you believe the absolute numbers or not, the relative numbers are kind of instructive in any event, because there was really very little deterioration because of these two events. It did drop from a high of 52 to 48% approval. But I would also argue that the 52 was always kind of a sampling error variation and a real change in opinion. If you had the God's knowledge truth, of what the real approval rating was, okay, and you took a random sample with a polling technique, you're going to get variations, in this case, plus or minus 3% around that number. And so I would tend to think that was just that the coin flips went in Trump's direction to get him up to 52 and went back to normal uh, uh, afterwards, and had very little to do with what was going on in the news. This is, I mean, especially when the same period his rating versus Biden increased by 2% during the same time period. So that kind of gives you an idea that, you know, and like I said, if you'd use the same technique in two separate but distinct polls that were, you know, boxed off from each other so the data wasn't mixed up, you might get two different numbers, plus or minus a few percent, using the same techniques in the same time period. So that's the way to look at that. That's something I think a lot of people don't. You need to know how to read these things and get a sense of it. Also with Rasmussen, I find interesting is they did a bunch of state polls, and they've got variations that are pretty big. For instance, they had Biden up to 4% in Ohio, and yet most people don't even consider that to be a very competitive state. So I think there's some, you know, some real question mark there. I mean, when you consider what the margin is probably going to be in favor of Biden in California, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Illinois, add those big population states up. And, you know, how do you get to 2% or even 4% nationally if you're going to have swings of maybe 20% in California? You know, so I think that, you know, that it seems like there's a little bit of difficulty in some of these state polls and how accurate they are. And that's probably one of the interesting things that need to take into account too as we follow this. So apparently Biden had quite a cash haul in August, although Trump came in pretty good too. I think it was what, 367 million versus I forget what, 200 and something. And of course, I think Trump had a bigger war chest built up previously, and I tend to think another aspect of all this, of course, is what you might call the sense of sufficiency. If you, you know, if you don't have enough to be on the air and do what you're doing, then you have trouble. But if you have enough, there is also the level of what I call, you know, oversaturation. And it appears that Trump does have a very good ground game. I mean, I don't see many Biden signs around where I am. Of course, maybe I'm in a Trump area, but I did see one Biden small bumper sticker on a car this morning. But at any rate, all I'm saying is it looks like there is a fairly good ground game going on for Trump, which may help. The other thing, I'll throw this in also, is that the Democrats seem to be indicating that they want to vote by mail absentee ballot, where that's the thing, or of course we have universal unsolicited ballots. I think that's a better term I find come across with. I think that's a good way to say it. You know, that'll be all mail, I guess. But since the Democrats are tending to vote by mail, and there's a tendency for people voting by mail to make errors and get their votes thrown out, if you will. Because of errors on filling out the forms. And on the other hand, voting in person, particularly where they have a voting machine type system, computerized or whatever, the likelihood of making an error, not getting your vote counted there, is much less. But, I mean, where I am, I know they've gone to a system where they actually do have a paper backup, and you do feed it into an optical reader, but it clearly prints it out with a printer, exactly what you've selected on the computer. So the result is, I think, much more likely to get your vote tabulated correctly. So it's possible that some of that effect may help Trump actually. On the other hand, places where you have universal unsolicited ballots presumably will help Biden, either because of the fact that that more of these ballots will fall into the wrong hands and may get voted even if they're not appropriate. And there's also thought that if all you have to do is fill out something you got in the mail and dump it back in the mail, maybe you're more likely to vote, so it may increase the turnout. I guess that's the other aspect of it. So we'll just have to see. But most of the places that have the unsolicited ballot system are states that are probably going to go Democrat anyhow, like, say, California. One of the clear exceptions, of course, would be Utah. But, and I guess Nevada's currently in a court battle over that, and I'm not sure how that'll end up. So anyway, I kind of is about it for now. I would still say if you have the resources to do so, particularly I think supporting your local Senate candidates where you have a competitive Senate rate is very important. Supporting Trump is very important, of course. And the other thing, I still find that the campaign needs, to me, to develop more of a comprehensive theme, particularly about what the Democrats plan to do if they get in control. I mean, they tend to make some radical changes, things that you never saw even with Obama. And I think that is something that needs to be driven home. If they eliminate the filibuster, just about anything goes if they have the majority and the presidency. It's going to be very difficult to stop them from rigging the Supreme Court and doing many bad things, and we'll be in a case of, I would say, kind of constitutional anarchy. Okay, and also I want to mention I have another video out which has got some play lately about George Floyd and my theory that in fact he actually did die of a drug overdose rather than asphyxiation by a police officer. And I think that's one I would really recommend people take a look at. If you like these videos, certainly subscribe. You can pass on links to friends that don't want to actually subscribe and like and make comments. I mean, feedback is appreciated. All for now.